I am an African.
But yeah, so I think I think we can go to the next question, seeing as we ended on the sort of Ethiopian, the note of Aksum, the Aksum Empire, getting sort of the credibility of being the era of Christianity in at least sub-Saharan Africa. We want to sort of see how Christianity in sort of the 20th century and how to be today. Why, like for example, I think I've got some stats here from Pew Research. So the struggle of Africa was around 1885, 84. So from the
1984 to 85.
Yes. So about around 20 years later, this research starts in the 1900s. And then the year 1900 to 2010. Traditional African religions, this is sub-Saharan Africa. Traditional African religions were at 76%. Muslims were at 14%. And then Christianity was at 9%. However, by 1960, which was around the independence era, we can see that it's hovering, Christianity was now the second largest after traditional religions at around 25%. Islam was following right behind around 24, 23. Traditional religions were still the majority, but now 57%. By now, I mean, this stands in 2010, so it could be higher or less. 57% of sub-Saharan Africans are Christian, 29% Muslim, and 13% believe in traditional religions. Now, why did we see such a rapid increase in Christianity at the time that colonialism was there? Because from what it shows here, that, in the periods around the beginning of colonialism, Christianity was the minority. So could you just elaborate to us what your reflections are on colonialism's role in sort of the wholesale, large-scale Christianity? Because obviously, I mean, anyone who studies African, history, the first thing that you learn is, I don't know if they study that in Nigeria, but definitely in Southern Africa, is that either there's 3 C's or the 3 G's, God, glory, and gold, I think, or the 3 C's, which is commerce, Christianity, and civilization. So can you explain to us this sort of understanding of colonialism's role in propelling Christianity in Africa?
No. So that's a bit of a complex question. I will try to answer it as simply, as briefly as I can, but it is really complex. So just give me a little bit of time and try. So it would take from the point that I was saying. Evidently, Christianity was a whole lot more within the Northern African sphere. And Northern African sphere was not, particularly relating with Sub-Saharan Africa as much. Don't forget that movements, the ability to access different places, affects how much we interact with each other. And so it wasn't that easy in terms of interaction as one. If you didn't have, large rivers that were connecting you and things like that. And so the spread of Christianity didn't happen as much from indigenous Africans down to Sub-Saharan Africa. That's just what we had. But on the other hand, it spread towards Europe. So, for instance, you take some of the monastic movements that happened within Egypt and the other parts of Africa, then went to Europe, to Ireland and different parts of those places. And then there was massive evangelization. And so it started to grow in Europe. There was the conversion of the barbarians and things like that. And so as you fast forward, there's the split church between, there's a great schism in the 11th century between East and West of Christianity. And I'm not mentioning other parts of Christianity that, like that you had in India, Far India, and all of those things. We're not getting into those. But fast forward, Middle Ages, again, not as much going on in terms of relationships. Now, at this point as well, you do have the rise of Islam, and over a period of time, Islam itself starts to take over the north parts of Africa. Doesn't take over Ethiopia, doesn't get all the way there, but it starts to come down. And so this lack of interaction and globalization meant that there wasn't as much the exchange of ideas. Now, as I said, there was the Portuguese that then came between the 15th century to about the 17th century, about 17th century. That didn't, in terms of putting Christian base, it didn't go as much, and a lot of them didn't go as much into the inland areas. But around the 18th century, huge things were happening in Europe. This was the rise of not just the Reformation, which happened. The Reformation is what split Western Christianity into the Roman Catholicism and what you call the Protestant churches, the Reformed churches. And after the Reformed Church, the Protestant Revolution, about 200 plus years, you started to have another kind of movement called the Great Awakening. So you've heard of figures like John Wesley, George Whitefield. But before that, there was also the German movement, the Moravians. And the Moravians then felt the impulse of evangelization beyond where they were. It wasn't a local evangelization, but it was let's go to the further parts of the world. So someone like George Whitefield eventually moves. He comes after the Moravians, and he goes to the United States. John Wesley is going all about around the whole of the United Kingdom, and there are lots of those movements. It's also the movement that eventually led to the abolishment of slavery, with someone like William Wilberforce, who had direct contact with John Wesley before he died. And so Christianity was really involved in abolishing slavery. And this was the impulse. Oh, go ahead.
So we have this sort of like this universalistic approach that that emanated from Germany, I believe, the Moravians, was sort of like to emancipate people, like a greater good type of notion.
Yeah, I would say, well, as Christians, we feel the first emancipation is a spiritual emancipation. And so it starts spiritually, but then it has social impact, right? So it can't, because Christians define a human being not just as an individual, but in relation to other people. We're social beings. And so what really happens to the person individually, for ill or for good, does eventually spread out to the society and then the culture. And so that's why, as many people were converted to Christianity during the time of the Great Awakening in England and so forth, social issues had to start coming, things had to start being challenged in that way. And so eventually there are missionary societies that were being formed, and they wanted to reach what they would call the heathen. And heathen was a word that would be used for Christians. The problem, though, was that it's well used simply in a spiritual way. It's a factual term, right? It's just a descriptive term. So it's like me saying, well, you guys are Zambians and you're not Nigerians, and maybe I want to persuade you to become a Nigerian, to have dual citizenship, right? So it's just stating something about where you are. And so when you think about heathen that way, okay, it's fine. These are people that don't believe in God the way we do believe in God. The problem, though, is that for some missionaries, and you mentioned the 3 C's, the heathen weren't just seen from the spiritual condition. They were seen from the economic condition, and they was also seen from their civilization condition. And so the 3 C's was a form of, a way of thinking about liberation of the people of Africa. Now, but at the same time, the governments themselves started to realize, so you mentioned the scramble for Africa, started to realize that there were loads of resources in Africa. And so there was a sort of uneasy dance between the government and the missionaries. A lot of the missionaries wanted to use the opportunities that was given to them to be able to reach the people. The government wanted to come on the back of those. Some of the missionaries knew exactly what was going on, but for them it was like, well, it's like Soviet. Yes, yeah, like Livingston. But Livingston was less. His motives were less pure, I would say. At least that's the way the record looks at it. Well, you had a lot more genuine ones. But the problem is that a lot of us were enculturated beings, right? Our ideologies, our beliefs are still formed within certain cultures. And so I'm saying there are positive, really a lot of positive impact of the missionaries that came within the colonial era. Like they helped us, they improved our health care, like the mortality rate, oh my gosh, before they came was dreadful. There are certain things socially that were social norms that I would say terrible, egregious, superstitious norms. I don't know if you guys know, but Nigeria, especially in my tribe, we are known for, we have the highest concentration of twins in the world. We produce the most number of twins in the world, right? And other tribes in Nigeria are also very good. There's a tribe called the Efiks around the Calabar area, and they literally, when you had twins, they thought it was a bad omen from the gods, and so they would always drown one of the other twins in the river. And the famous missionary called Mary Slessor, I think she was from Scotland, and through a lot of her work, that was banished. So, we can't just say, well, it's more complex to just say, well, they just came to change our cultures and look down on that. No, they came with a lot of good things, and I would do, even then as a Christian, to say that, well, the message that eventually transformed you spiritually, that gives you stability in this world spiritually, but also promises you eternity, was a blissful future. They brought that as well. Having said that, there were negative impacts, a lot of negative impact. First of all, you should think about it from the government part. The government were just not. It was about expanding the empire, but also enriching the empire. Do you know how many Africans fought in the First World War and Second World War? Hardly a monument actually given to a lot of them that died. That was a problem, right? They were recruited from Nigeria, recruited from various parts of the world, and they're not actually. If you go there, I think I visited in London, where you have a cenotaph and some of these monuments there. They're not mentioned. Their names aren't mentioned. The countries are not even acknowledged. Right, they exacted certain imperial taxes upon us and things like that, right? And a lot of them came in because a lot of the people accepted the missionaries, right? And so there's problems with that. There's also, I think for me, the biggest impact on this is two things that I related. It was the entrenching of the superiority of the European culture, quote-unquote civilization, and also entrenching the idea of the inferiority of the African cultures. And so, first of all, there's a sort of dismissiveness of our way of life. Because they believed they had a superior, or let's just say a better, spiritual message, they also believed that their civilization and their culture was also superior, and implicitly that the European is also above the African. Now, it's not said, that's why I said it's implicit, but this is anti-Christian, because even whether you're a Christian or not, the Bible says that all human beings are created in the image of God, which means we all have equal worth before God. So no one, even when you believe in that God, you can't say that you're above the other one. Now, you can say that, hey, here's a message that leads you and makes you wiser for salvation to God, but it doesn't make you actually better. But this is kind of thing that happened. And so they dismissed a lot of our cultural norms. And the cultural norms were at least I can speak with the Yoruba religion and the other ones, but it was, you had the religion at the center, but you had a civilization formed around it, a civilization that had, implications for what it means to have a family. We had a system for what we do at birth, how people died, the afterworld, how you appease the gods, how we deal with our vocation, and all of those things. Now, as a Christian, I do believe that the religious system itself, I don't believe it's true. I do think that Christianity makes a compelling case, and I'm not converting to that just because a European brought it. That's why I've brought it to our continent. I've already said that Christianity actually had its seedbed. European Christianity had its seedbed in Africa. So that is an issue of truth. It's an issue of worldview, and that's not the preserve of any earnest. However, I do want to say that because, as the Bible tells us, that God has revealed himself in some ways in all places, right? Not, but we'll say especially in Christianity, in all places, there's a sense of God around, that you would actually find civilizations in different places. We have the Benin Kingdom, for instance, here, which is one of the most sophisticated kingdoms that you find from the 13th and 14th century. You know, there was the Great Wall of Benin, I think probably even before the Great Wall of China. So to come in and just look at the people that say they're heathen because they don't have the message of Christianity, and think that all the practices there that they have weren't actually, you know, it wasn't high culture. There was a certain level of dismissiveness that they came with. And so when they were introducing Christianity, rather than understand our cultures better and then see how you integrate Christianity within the system of that culture and delineate between what is European culture and the pure gospel message, there wasn't a lot of that. And so there are things that they could have kept, that which we've recovered now. So for instance, the way we did our marriages, you know, they told them not only if you're a Christian, you cannot have those traditional marriages, right? That's a problem, right? The traditional marriages were family affairs, and it held the society together. The way we did our naming ceremonies, they said, well, you can't do those. You either choose baptism of your children or the traditional naming ceremonies. And there are ways you could change that now. A lot of that we've also recovered. It was the same thing with our names as well. They said you cannot have those indigenous names. You should have Christian names. There is no such thing as Christian names. Christian names, you have, it was European names. But now you can have names with Christian meaning, but can have African languages. And so those are some of the effects. Maybe I'll just finish with this. What that has entrenched in us is this sort of, I don't even think we're finally coming from that. And I've had to even deal with some of these in my own. I spent about almost 8 years in Europe, living there. But I'd been, you know, when I was younger, traveling for holiday and things like that. I wouldn't lie to you. I grew up thinking white was right. There was this British television series. It was called Robin Hood. You know, it was in the early 80s when I was growing up. And there was the guy that played Robin Hood was a guy called Michael Praed. And I just remembered his long hair. And I always just wanted to have long hair. I remember when David Beckham came on the scene, I always wanted to have hair like David Beckham. And what do we use? Both our women now, with the long wig and things like that, flowy hair. What do we use to make our hair like the European people's hair? We use something called a relaxer. Now think about that name, a relaxer. Our hair, our natural hair, needs to be relaxed. Why? Because that's telling you that naturally we're almost savage-like, and we have to be relaxed. You know, we're even speaking about this biologically, not even just sociologically. And so the kind of damage that this has done, where we've forgotten about our history, we're not even looking to the history of Christianity in Africa. We look to the white man in some ways to come and save us. We reference best practices in our organizations based on what is done in the West. We always look to the West for some kind of validation. And I think these are some of the sociological, cultural effects that have happened when Christianity came in, not just as this spiritual thing that needed to find its way enculturated in our systems, but came as a civilizing project as well as a commercializing project. So, as I said, it's a bit more complex, but that's what I can say about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know what you think, Nathan, but I mean, if I could just weigh in, I think it's very, very insightful, because you have sort of considered sort of the interaction between the missionaries who, from their perspective, believe they're doing something good, and then sort of the way in which the government and political and commercial system use that almost as a glove in which to perpetuate colonization. So just, I mean, I do wonder then now if Christianity would be as big as it is now had they not been the full backing of European governments and economic appetite, if the missionaries were simply on their own, would we have had the Christianity, one, as prevalent as it is now, and two, as you said, as European in terms of our understanding of it in its large scale as it is now? Would we have had a more Africanized Christianity had it not been for full scale, if say the Christianity was done through a missionary going to a kingdom, the Asante kingdom, or going to the Zulu kingdom, and colonization never happened. And they're just like, oh yeah, okay. Shaka Zulu was like, yeah, you guys, if you want to convert, cool, I'm good, fine. Yeah. So just like if you could give us like a quick answer to that. If colonialization did not happen through government and commercial means, and missionaries were just simply allowed to interact, and it was a good little cultural exchange, would we have had Christianity to the extent that it is now, and would we have had a more Africanized type of Christianity?
My answer to that actually is Christianity didn't grow and explode the way it is because of the missionaries. Actually, it actually exploded because, in fact, let me put it another way. The way the Europeans, the European form of Christianity that eventually came in sub-Saharan Africa, if that continued to be practiced, Christianity would be dying. Like, that form is already dying. And this leads to another thing that used to happen at, in those times. Because what would happen, even a lot of the people who were Christians, who converted as Christians, Africans that converted as Christians, you have to actually question their authenticity when they came. Because what they saw was that, hey, these guys are bringing education. The formal education was actually a good thing in some parts of it, even though some of that was teaching about empire and stuff like that. But, math is math. It's whether you're European or, and in fact, math didn't even originate with the Europeans. So that's another question entirely. At least the numbering system is Arabian. But if you remove that, I would say the education, the healthcare, all of those things were important. And so a lot of Africans didn't really like them, but they liked what they brought. And so they converted because of that. But once they got what they wanted, they were still practicing their traditional religions and stuff like that. What made the difference was when Africans started to own Christianity in the way Africans wanted to practice. And so this gave rise to what we call the African independent churches. Now, here's how you know part of the problem. Some of the prejudices that were existed, a lot of prejudices that happen even today, you see this all over the world. They say there's nothing that maybe a Westerner hates more than a black man who actually knows onions, or a black man that's full of confidence. This started happening within Christianity first, because what you'd often have is there would be these missionary churches, and then within those missionary churches, you'd have a guy who probably has his own encounter, revelation with God, and starts to do his thing. He gets a bit powerful. They try to stop him within the church setting. He actually doesn't relent. He's kicked out, and then he starts his church. Now his church still having forms of Christianity, but actually much more enculturated in the way people would understand, and maybe sometimes not always orthodox. But what happened was people started flocking towards those churches, and they were having much more, if you like, and I don't know what you guys think about this, but I'll just put my own cards on the table. I think one of the things that Christianity brings is to look at the human being as a whole person, and so that is formation intellectually. That's thinking about the mind. It's formation vocationally. That's thinking about our hands. It's formation, emotionally or inspirationally, thinking about our feelings. But it's also formation spiritually. And so encounters with the divine, many of those guys were actually seen supernatural things happen. In fact, they were having more of that than the intellectual part, because they weren't as formed. And so with the Africans, who are very, very spiritually aware and very, very in touch with the spiritual world, when they see that happening, they were able to give up what we would call idols much faster than somebody who is coming with a rationalistic, systematic approach to it. In Nigeria, we have something called power past power. That is, there are powers and there are greater powers. And so a lot of people actually started converting as a result of those things. And so it was the owning of the Christianity in an African way that actually made it explode. And later, the latter part, well, not even the latter part, the mid part of the 20th century, that's when we started to see an explosion of what you call Pentecostalism. But it was first indigenous Pentecostalism. This even rose. This rose in the. So let me a quick one. There's a movement here in Nigeria. They're called the Aladuras. The Aladura just means praying people in Yoruba, praying people. Why did that movement take off? And this is in the mid 1910s to around 1920. Why did it take off? I'll tell you. It was the first pandemic that we had in the 20th century. It was the Spanish flu. And the Spanish flu was ravaging Europe, but eventually came to Africa. Right? Ravaging through, and just like this last one, there was no cure for it. People were just dying. And we didn't have a lot of medical, help. Even the guys that did have medical advancement, they didn't know what to do with it in Europe. And so literally all we had, people were literally living on a prayer, as Bon Jovi says, right? And these movements, when people were seeing people being healed by these group of people, Adura in Yoruba is prayer. So Aladuras are praying people. And that's how, the movement was born. And it brought a lot of converts. In the 30s and 40s, we had a guy who was part of the Pentecostal Apostolic Church that come from Britain. And also, Britain, I think, not the... And, they set up in their European ways and all that. It was a little bit more supernatural. But there was a guy within that, an uneducated guy called Joseph Babalola. And he just started having encounters with God and things like that. It was very, very miraculous. And that gave rise to, he was in the Apostolic Church. That was European. But then he started something called the Christian Apostolic Church, CAC. There was TAC, CAC. CAC is 100 times bigger till today than the TAC. So what I'm saying is that the explosion of Christianity, actually, in the latter part of the 20th century, is, I would say, a reaffirmation of our Africanness in Christianity. It was almost a re-owning of it. Now, it has problems. I'm not going to say it doesn't have problems. In many ways, you have personalities over the church. You have, the prosperity gospel, the extremes of that, where with scams and fake miracles and, some pastors just trying to line their pockets. They are the extremes of that, and I'm not denying that. But I think sometimes they're all lumped up together as the wrong thing. And I'll say that it has been one of the best things that has happened for us to re-own our African identity and take control of the Christianity that was already here years before. So yes, I would disagree that that it was the colonial, the missionary era that enabled the explosion of Christianity. I would say in sub-Saharan Africa, it started to bring more of the introduction, right, to it, but it only really grew and exploded because
I am an African.